Corey asked me a long time ago to do this, and I thought initially about several other times I've spoken to this group about Christianity and politics or religion and politics in one form or another. And I had some ideas how to do it. And then over the past several weeks, just experiences of living my life. For example, going down to Long Island to visit some old friends and encountering people who disagreed with me completely about who they were going to vote for, but who are exemplary Christians that I could not respect more, led me to think that what God was leading Corey to ask for when he gave me the title, How to Be a Christian in Election Year, was how to conduct yourself as a Christian in a really disturbing election year. Because this is, by all accounts, a really disturbing election. The two major party candidates are both really controversial. Their negative evaluations outweigh their positive evaluations, as you guys all know. So I want to start off with how to be at peace with yourself and God during a particularly disturbing election. Then I'll talk about how to conduct yourself towards others during an election that generates really strong opinions. And then I will talk a little bit about the imperfections, what makes this election special and unusual, having these two really imperfect candidates. And then a little bit about what factors you can think about when you go into the voting booth. They're not going to be designed to lead you to vote for one candidate over another, but just things that we could all be thinking about. And then finish up with a discussion of how to keep this whole election in a Christian perspective. So first, how to be at peace with yourself and God during a particularly disturbing election. This is actually my first and last point. Start and end the talk with this. Keep politics in perspective. I chose 1 Timothy 2, verse 2. Pray this way for kings and all who are in authority, so that we may live peaceful and quiet lives marked by godliness and dignity. Now, I happen to have in my hands the New Living Translation when I was doing this, so where I have biblical passages, they're going to be from the New Living. But I picked that one. There's a lot of them. I mean, Paul has a passage in Romans about praying for those in authority, and 1 Peter, I think, also. But I picked this one because implicit in it is two things I think are important to keep in mind. One is that we pray for kings and all those in authority so we may lead quiet and peaceful lives. So that we should first pray for those in authority, but that we're not doing it so that the right guy will win the election or so that particular outcomes that we want will come to pass. But it puts in perspective that our job as Christians is to grow up into Christ-likeness. We should become more mature and more like Jesus all the time and glorify God by doing good works that he has in mind for us to do. And that's what I think Paul means when he says, so that we may live peaceful and quiet lives. The other is that this passage suggests to me that government, to Paul, is kind of like the weather. That you want it to be okay so that you can live successfully. You don't want it like blowing away your house or flooding. That the state is a source of potential problems for you. And so you pray for those in authority so that God will keep the political weather from getting in your way as you grow up, as you pursue godliness in a Christ-like way. Now, the second tip I would give you, also biblical, is from Philippians 4:8. Fix your thoughts, Paul says, on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. there's a typo in this next sentence. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise, not think about things. It sounds like Dr. Seuss. So the things you can think, but anyway. When I think of fixing my thoughts on what's true and honorable, right and pure and lovely and admirable, I am reminded of a passage I should have looked up. Paul says somewhere in his letters, fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of your faith. And I think that's good advice anytime, but especially when you are upset by what you're hearing on the evening news or the last debate that you just watched. In addition to fixing your eyes on Jesus, though, I think it's a really good idea to just think about people who've been really good examples of Christ-like behavior in your life. Our pastor, Taylor Jackson, on Sunday was preaching about Philippians and a section where Paul is talking about Timothy and Epaphroditus and how much they served the gospel and how Timothy cared about people and not about his self-interest and so on. We've all got people like that. More recently, for me, it's my mother-in-law and father-in-law who are really like parents to me. They're both dead now, but they were such exemplary Christians. They were models of a godly life. But going back to my high school years, I used to go to the United Presbyterian Youth Group all the time, even though I really had a hang-up over the atonement. That's a long story for another day, but I did not understand why God had to inflict all this punishment on Jesus if he wanted to forgive people when he had it in his power to just forgive them. I now think I understand that much better, but I didn't then. And I kind of fell away in college years. I didn't... I think I thought I was a Christian the whole time I wasn't going to church at all. But my United Presbyterian youth leaders, Harold and Marie Dunlap, got me through the 60s in a way that they have no idea. Because in the 1960s on campus, you had free sex, drugs, the triumph of hedonism, and an actual countercultural challenge. It wasn't just that there were people using drugs and having sex wantonly, but that they were challenging the whole moral authority of the establishment in a lot of ways. And a lot of my friends admired these people, and they were seeking to create, an alternative view of morality. And I'm not going to say that I thought about this more deeply than I actually did, but I looked at these hippies, basically, and I thought about Harold and Marie Dunlap, and I thought, centered, sane, crazy, centered, sane, crazy, And I think they got me through the 60s, not to say that I was a sinless person by any means, but there was just a lot of stuff that I did not even think about doing because the adults in my life had been so sane and sensible and such good examples. And so I would encourage you guys to think about what is good and excellent and true and admirable, and think about people who have been good examples in your life, because neither major party candidate seems to be a real great example of anything. I have really strong opinions about one of them, but I think it's just good to shift your focus away from that and think about people who are good examples. Third, I've thought about this a lot over the past year, at least, maybe more, going back to the beginning of the debates. A lot of what's going on this year is extremely upsetting, and I think it's less upsetting if you think about God's purposes as being different than ours. And one thing biblically that I think you can count on is that when people make things into false gods, God will expose them as false. It's part of what he does, and it's part of his showing you what truth is to expose the falsity and other things. At our church, Hamilton Bible Fellowship, a long, long time ago, we had a woman named Dorothy Maas who was a chronic speaker during our praise and worship time. She never passed up a chance to share. But she used to say all the time, FBI agents are trained to tell counterfeit bills by being forced to look at real ones. You look at real bills until you know them when you see them, and then you can recognize counterfeits. And I think that's there's truth in that. I think that when you focus on Jesus and you focus on what's good and true, you will see the faults and it will be exposed for you. And I think God is exposing. There are a lot of things that have become false gods. I have a reference here to a guy named William Stringfellow. He too is dead now. The late Casey Stengel once said, most people my age are dead at the present time. And so it's like a lot of people I've read are dead at the present time. But anyway, William Stringfellow was an Episcopal layman who wrote an awful lot of books that I found really useful. He is famous in the religious community for his conception of principalities and powers. Paul refers to the principalities and powers. And the principalities and powers are supposed to serve us. But after the fall, Stringfellow says the principalities and powers actually get us to serve them in some way. Now, I don't know whether I buy this or not, but I will say that there just are a lot of things in modern life that demand our total allegiance that are really false gods of one kind or another. And political parties are one of them. Political parties are a good thing. I'm a political scientist. I believe in parties. And when I see, for example, that the Democrats and the WikiLeaks were trying to do what they could to like shape up Hillary Clinton, it doesn't bother me because I like parties. But parties have become sources of, they've just become sources of so much conformity. I mean, there's just so much insistence on towing a party line, and everything from what you see on TV to Facebook to whatever. And this idea that there's, the other party is evil and only my party is good. We're actually doing a search right now in political science, and one of the candidates is doing research that shows that increasingly party polarization is rooted in the desire for identity. It's not even ideology as much as it is identity, that people are looking for a group identity to reduce psychological uncertainty. And when you're looking for it as a source of identity, then it becomes this thing where it's an in-group, out-group thing, and you're so concerned about being in this group and this group being right that you don't even read the other side or hear the other side or entertain anything that disagrees with you. And at that point, it's starting to become a false god, or what Stringfellow would call a principality and powers. And here's where I would remind you of something C.S. Lewis said somewhere. I've read a lot of C.S. Lewis. I don't remember where it was. Political parties, like nation states, are fallen and temporal. They will pass away. Jesus does not pass away. America will pass away, and heaven knows the Democrats and Republicans will pass away. So you need to put your allegiance in what is eternal. Okay? Now, second, this may be even more important. The first one, I could summarize my talk today by saying it's all about how to avoid being totally depressed and a horrible friend in a bad election year. Now we get to the how to avoid being a horrible friend. How to conduct yourself towards others during an election that generates really strong opinions. I thought a lot about whether it was a good idea or not to say this, but I think it only makes sense for me to say what I'm going to say in this section if I tell you that Donald Trump frightens me. I think he is the most dangerous man to run for president, and I don't know when. He is immature, he is needy, he's misogynist, he's easily flattered, there's like all sorts of things wrong with him, and I live in a bubble. There may be people here who like Trump, but it's like most of you probably are closeted because so many people on the university campus don't like Trump. And so everybody I talk to doesn't like Trump. And I went down to Long Island with my wife. My mother-in-law and father, my wife grew up in Smithtown. And my father-in-law died last November. And the house is now sold. It took a long time. The estate is settled, the house is sold. And we have no family ties to take us down there. But we have these friends. My wife has been friends with Linda Karminski since the 12th grade, and she went to Stony Brook with her. And Linda met Eric in a Christian youth group, and so they've been married a long time. My wife was in their wedding. I have, since marrying my wife 41 years ago, gone to see these people every holiday. I mean, we're down there a lot, and I've seen them. So it's like we are 41-year families, couples, friends, right? very, 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 very strong Christians. And convicting. I mean, these are, I don't mean like they lay guilt on you. I mean, their lives are so good, you are ashamed by comparison. These, Linda and Eric raised three exemplary girls. That was just a mistake. There was nothing Freud in there. Three of the most exemplary girls I can imagine. One of them is doing missions work in Brazil, And when they were all grown and out of college, they adopted, and they were in their 60s, they adopted three more children, one from the old Soviet Union and two from Ethiopia. So they have three kids in their house again. They got 3 bedrooms, they filled them up, right? And they homeschooled them for a long time, and now they're in regular school, and they're doing everything they can at a time when I have to rest to get enough energy to come over here, So you could not be better Christians than they are. And we go down there, and it quickly becomes apparent that Eric really likes Trump, or maybe the more accurate way to put it is he really fears Hillary Clinton. And I can't defend Hillary Clinton. I don't think Hillary Clinton's as bad as a lot of people think she is. I already had this drama because in 2008 I was registered Democratic and I had to pick between Obama and Hillary Clinton, and I was concerned that Obama had so little experience. He passed through the Senate. He went in the front door and out the back to run for president. And George W. Bush made a big mess of things, having no experience. And so I looked into Hillary Clinton at that time. And so I do think the right-wing caricatures of her are somewhat inaccurate. But still, you got the emails, you've got all this stuff going on with her. And I don't want to defend her against Eric. So it was really difficult. And we stopped talking about politics at all for a while talking about everything else. We went places, we went to the Phipps estate, we did all sorts of things and did fun things, and we just didn't talk about politics. There was a debate while we were down there. It helped that they don't have television, but they do have computers, and I think they would have watched the debate if we hadn't been there. I think their shock was as great as mine. It's like, oh my gosh, they don't like Trump. They had a family dinner, all sorts of people come over, and it's like they're all just making anti-Hillary jokes and loving Trump, and it's like, wow, I lived in a bubble. That's when I found out I lived in a bubble. I lived in this liberal arts college bubble where everybody hates Trump. And I discovered that people I cannot dismiss or denigrate very much prefer him to Hillary Clinton. So, lessons I would take away from that and offer you are, remember that you are a Christian first and foremost. Conduct yourself in a way that is a credit to the gospel. Glorifying God matters more than changing the way somebody votes. Okay. Second, pray for the maintenance and restoration of right relationships. There's a really good book on religion and politics. I'm trying to remember. Roy Heron is the author of it. I've talked about it in this group before. He talks about the word shalom, and that the word shalom actually means right relationships, so that when you pray for shalom, you're praying for the restoration of broken relationships, and you should always be trying to maintain right relationships and fix broken ones. So don't let political differences cause rifts with family members or friends. That is Satan's agenda and not Christ's agenda. Third, there's a debate tonight. I forget which Christian author I read who said, flee temptation. If you're worried about adultery, don't get yourself in a situation where there's a woman undressed, that kind of thing. Don't even go close to that. Well, you might want to avoid watching debates with people who favor the other candidate. I've watched Super Bowls with people who were rooting for the other team. It doesn't go well. So that would be my advice to you. Unless you have really reached this point of Christian maturity, because you have internalized everything I have said in the first part of this talk, so you can actually handle that. But Eric and I decided we didn't talk about it, we just didn't watch the debate at all. So I think we secretly watched it on our phones in our spare time over the course of the next 2 or 3 days. Now this year is unusual because we have 2 candidates that are so unpopular, and it's the first time I can remember where you take the approve and disapprove ratings and subtract disapproval from approval, and they're both in the negatives. And shockingly far into the negatives. Most people I know are voting against the candidate they fear the most, rather than for the candidate they like the most. People say to me, is this the worst election year ever for you? And I say, no, 1968 was worse. Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King were both killed that year. That was a worse year. But the candidates were better at the end than was the case this time around. One option is voting for a third-party candidate. And I don't know what to tell you about that. Because on the one hand, well, I mean, I'll tell you both sides. I know both sides of that argument. If there's somebody that you really, really, really don't want to win and you vote for a third-party candidate, you can end up by failing to vote for the other major party candidate, leading to the election of the person you don't want. Ralph Nader drew enough votes away from Al Gore in 2000 that Gore lost Florida. So go ahead and vote for Jill Stein, but you may repent later. On the other hand, we have a two-party duopoly. The two major parties have control over our choices, basically, and they have failed this year spectacularly, especially the Republicans, I think. I mean, because in a lot of ways, and I don't want to fight with anybody here who doesn't like Hillary Clinton, but she is like a normal politician, and she's like a Democrat, and she's got Democratic views, and she's got a lot of experience, and I don't see the Democrats as having failed in a public responsibility some way by nominating her in quite the same way as the Republicans in nominating this foul-mouthed reality TV star. But anyway, if you feel like, I believe in communicating with my vote. For example, in New York State, there's a lot of minor party candidates on the ballot, or there will be cross endorsements, like the Conservative Party might endorse Trump or Romney last time around or whatever. Sometimes I'll vote on one of those just because it says something I want to say. And you might want to communicate your disgust with the two parties by voting for one of the minor party candidates. And I think that's a perfectly valid thing to do. That if you feel like the two parties are getting more polarized and less constructive as forces for solving our problems, and you want to communicate that with a third-party vote, that makes some sense to me. That's not what I'm going to do myself, but I think it's perfectly reasonable. I also would say, since I do know some math, people say, well, if you're not voting for Hillary Clinton, you're voting for Donald Trump. And it's like, well, no, that really isn't true. Like, if you were going to vote Republican, but you shift from Trump to Clinton, that's like a shift of 2, -1 from him and +1 to her. But if you shift to Gary Johnson, it's just -1. You know, it's like it's a vote that doesn't go to him. And the same thing would be true for Clinton and Jill Stein in reverse. So what factors should we consider when we go into the voting booth? I would say first, policies matter, and if you really feel strongly on one or more issues. For me, the environment is one issue, and if I were president, I would appoint somebody really serious to be Attorney General, and I would solve that whole racial injustice and policing thing until it was done. That would be like right after climate change, those would be my two priorities, because I just think it's the most serious problem, domestic problem facing the country today. But that's me. Try to be really informed on whatever the policies are that you care about. Find out as much as you can. Find out about the candidates' positions and vote accordingly. And along the way, look at what their positions are. See how specific they are, how well conceived they seem to be, and whether you think they're actually going to work. Another good piece of advice is you're electing an administration and not just one person. So think about the fact that Hillary Clinton is going to staff the executive branch with Democrats, and Donald Trump will presumably staff it with Republicans, and their court appointments will be different. And so that's another valid ground for voting. Second, I would say that character matters, and I would look at the past and present behavior of each candidate. Do they seem worthy to serve as president? Will we be embarrassed to be represented? by these people? Do they seem to have judgment and self-control and relevant experience? Do they play well with others? Do they seem like people who could work across the aisle to actually pass bills? And finally, well, not finally, I've got 2 more points. The long-term survival of our nation matters. And in this regard, if you're like me, I like to vote on domestic policy, but foreign policy can get us blown up. I mean, foreign policy is more serious in a lot of ways. I would also say that democracy matters, and our survival as a working democracy depends on things like a respect for freedom of the press and respect for people who disagree with us, a respect for the electoral process, and which candidate will pass along to the next generation a properly functioning democratic system. Finally, be realistic. Making the world a better place through politics is a marathon and not a sprint. Nina knows, Professor Moore knows, that my research centers on something called incrementalism and whether it is possible to make policy through really big changes, or whether it's better to make it through really big changes or just to steadily accumulate progress through a series of smaller steps. Whether it's better or not, that's the way it happens. It's very unusual to have something like a revolution, and so you shouldn't judge harshly people who promise you small changes but seem like they're in it for the long haul. Okay, so bringing that all back together, however you vote, try to keep things in a proper Christian perspective. Politics matters a lot. I wouldn't study it if I didn't think it was important, and I love it, and I think it's honorable and a really important thing to do. But in the next world, politics will disappear because we will all be filled with the Spirit of Christ, and a lot of the conflict that goes on now will just not be there. So we will live under the lordship of Christ in the kingdom of God. I think sometimes I have misspent my life because I spent my life studying this thing that will go away in the new heavens and the new earth, but I know by all accounts there will be singing. So I should probably be involved in the music ministry of my church. Second, remember that God is sovereign and in control, and his ways are not our ways, and his thoughts are not our thoughts. We don't have to save the world through politics. Jesus saved the world through what he accomplished on the cross. And our job is to have faith, to grow into Christian maturity, and to glorify God through the good works he has planned for us. And these things don't depend on who wins the election. So I would suggest, and this is very autobiographical, an attitude adjustment. This is not just me in politics, this is me in everything. One of the things I've discovered a lot lately is that I need to relax and let God be God. This doesn't mean you just blow off everything and don't try hard, or like if you really care about politics and you want Hillary Clinton to be the first woman president or whatever, you can work as hard as you want, but relinquish control over the outcome. You can't determine the outcome, even if you work in one of the campaigns, but certainly not if you vote. If you just vote, you're one vote among millions, and you really can't control the outcome. But that's okay, because God is sovereign and will control the outcome. And I think that's part of what Jesus meant when he said, "Come to me, you who are heavy laden, because my yoke is easy and my burden is light." It's like, I don't need you to do the heavy lifting. I'm doing the heavy lifting. I've done the heavy lifting. What I need you to do is manifest Christ where you are, to the people in front of you. Be a steadily more Jesus-like person in all that you do, and I'll take care of all the rest. So I would say relax and let God be God, and let him control the outcome, and that's an attitude adjustment that is making a real difference for me. I find that true not just in politics, but when I'm serving on a search committee or when I'm involved in a tenure case or whatever else. I have this tendency to want to get the outcome where I think it should be. And you can't do it. you can work as hard as possible to do what you think needs to be done, but you have to just let go and let God be God, because you're not. Okay, so any questions? Yeah.
First, thank you very much for a great talk. My question is, the things that you wrote down here seem to be filters for how you interpret the world and how you find yourself as a Christian in this political, in the political landscape. How would you apply Christian philosophy to specific policies or specific visions of how our country should be?
I think I have a two-part answer. The first is that I don't think the Bible points to any obvious political ideology. I think there's lots of room for Christian Republicans and Christian Democrats and Christian Labor Party and conservatives and so on in Britain or whatever. But I also think, here's where I'm going to suggest a different author, Reinhold Niebuhr, who died a long, long time ago, but was one of the nation's foremost theologians in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. Niebuhr feels that man's sinfulness creates injustice and the need for political involvement, but that man's sinfulness also means that all of our attempts at reform will also be corrupt and will necessarily be incomplete, which sort of is, that's the Christian moral underpinning to what I said when I said changing the world through politics is a marathon and not a sprint. That I think that anything we do will inevitably be incomplete. And, well, let me give you an example. He was saying Marxism, when Niebuhr was first writing, the Great Depression was going on and capitalism seemed to be failing, and it was popular. Marxism was about as popular as it ever got during that period. And Niebuhr said at one point that God obviously and necessarily prefers the poor and disadvantaged over the rich and advantaged. Now, I say this to you speaking as a parent. When you're a parent, you'll understand. It's like you love all your children equally, but if one of them is picking on the other one, you take up the cause of the one that's being picked on because they need the support. They need you to come in and stop whatever's going on that's wrong. But, he said, I'm going back to Niebuhr now, if you just inverted the pyramid and put the proletariat at the top and the old elite at the bottom, within a very short time, the people that you just put at the top would be corrupt and sinful and abusing power and throwing their weight around, and you would have this sinful outcome. Because, now, I really recommend Niebuhr for like 1,000 reasons, but the best thing about Niebuhr for me is that Niebuhr never, for even a second, loses sight of the power and universality and the universal and destructive nature of sin. He's just the least naive writer I know. It's like everything is corrupted by sin. You are corrupted by sin. My best actions and my best motives are corrupted by sin. There is nothing about you that isn't corrupted by sin. That doesn't mean, however, that mixed motives are bad. That's just all you got. It's like there's a combination of sin and good motives. And so it's good to try really hard to do something good, whether it's through politics or anything else. But you have to understand always that you will be corrupted by sin, and your sin will keep you from really seeing clearly the ways in which you're corrupted. So that's a 2 point. I'm not sure whether I've answered you, but the first part is that I don't think there's a political program that Jesus could embrace. And I do think it's really important for me to say to you guys that liberalism and conservatism are forms of humanism, and that most people who are liberal or conservative are advancing these ideologies without rooting them at all in religious faith. There are some Christians who are active in politics. There are many more people in politics who claim to be Christians but are not. They're nominal or fraudulent. But I do think, like I say, that there's no humanist program that the Bible points to. The Bible tends to point to things like, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You know, it's a radically different way of thinking about things. And I feel myself, I'm a kind of a Niebuhrian liberal. I feel like we should try to make the world better through politics. I'm not one who thinks that because everybody is corrupted by sin that there's no point. I think we should try to make the world better through politics, but I think you have to expect that that quest will never be complete in this life. And there will always be a need for reform. And the reforms will also always be corrupt and incomplete.
So, to follow up, what would you say to a person who's read the Bible and thinks that they have interpreted what the ideal political and economic system would be?
I guess my first piece of advice would be that a proper humility is the first takeaway from the Bible. And as a part of that, that you should always be open to and read people who have other points of view. One of the things I did in high school and college, I was a high school and college debater, and if any of you have ever debated, we did policy debates, and you'd have a topic and it would last a whole year, but it's like round one you might be on affirmative, and then round two you're negative, and round three you're affirmative, and round four you're negative, and round five, and so on. And two lessons from that. One is there's always a really good argument on the other side. You have to argue both sides, ultimately, and you discover there's really a good argument on the other side of everything, which an increasingly large number of people don't seem to be aware of. I mean, it's just like we got this polarizing world in which people think only one side is right. It's like you really need to read the other side. There's always a good argument for the other side. And the second thing I learned from debate is that by the end of the year, policy ideas you thought were really good have been exposed. And every year I ever debated, by the time you got to the nationals, not that I ever made the nationals, but I mean, by the time you got to nationals, if you won the coin flip in the quarterfinals, you picked negative, because there were no affirmative cases that could win. You let 1,200 or 1,000, 2,000 or 5,000 college debaters explore a topic long enough, they'll find something wrong with everything. So you'll just find that your mind changes. And so I think that would be my answer to you, is just, if you think you've found exactly what God wants, you probably haven't. And you should read other people as well. Because what God has in mind is the kingdom of God, which happens in the new heavens and the new earth when sin is defeated and is no more, through the work of the Holy Spirit. So, and unless you get to that point, which you're not going to get to in this world, you're just talking about mitigating and ameliorating problems. Any other questions? Well, good. Thank you very much.